What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 bad games that I enjoyed, which is a video I've made roughly almost every year for the past few years, talking about some games where my opinion, of course, about various titles was a bit against the grain in the sense that I enjoyed titles that were otherwise considered not great. Now, this follows a few weeks back where I made a separate video talking about games that a lot of people loved that I did not, because obviously this kind of thing tends to go both ways because that's how opinions work, which is why I think videos like this are interesting. But let's be real, there's exactly one game people are clicking on this video to hear me talk about, and we'll get to that in a moment. But here towards the beginning, I especially enjoy talking about this particular subject because no matter how bad you think a game is or how poorly you think it was received, I can pretty much promise you that somebody enjoyed that game, and moreover, it's probably somebody's favorite game. And stuff like that is exactly why I think it's important, especially for somebody like myself, to, when you have an opinion, have the wherewithal to stick by it regardless of the overall conversation surrounding a title. Not least of which, because frankly, somebody whose opinion sways any which way depending on the overall vibes at the moment is really only serving up what people want to hear and not what they actually think. And with that said, let's dive fully into it. Now, we are going to kick this off with the game that I'm sure pretty much everybody clicked on this video to hear about, and that is Dragon Age the Veilguard. I think it's pretty safe to say my most controversial review by far and away. And while this game has honestly been talked to death a little bit at this point, and we'll get into some of that, I did actually want to make this segment a little more interesting for people and give you some information, at least on my end, that I know you couldn't have possibly seen up to this point. So to give a little bit of context here, I put out my review for Veilguard about 3 days before the game actually launched, and almost immediately people were like, actually, this game is terrible because another reviewer's opinion said so, and thus you have to be wrong, which is a very interesting stance to take for a game they definitely hadn't played at the time. But alas, that's the way it goes sometimes. Now, I will say just right there, though, I mentioned in my own review of that game that it was going to be very divisive amongst people. And to that end, to the people who have played Veilguard, gave it a genuine try and just didn't like it, I absolutely respect that opinion. Especially since, even for somebody who enjoyed Veilguard much more than most, I still absolutely think it has flaws that are worth discussing one way or another. But in any event, the reason I bring all this up is the sort of conversation surrounding that video obviously had a lot of people talking, and, as the internet does, some of the things they were saying were just incorrect. And so to that end, I thought it would be fun in this video to kind of show the sort of behind-the-scenes metrics like right now. Simply because, for starters, I absolutely still stand by that review, but also because that video actually did very well for me. And while it is true the like to dislike ratio isn't fantastic, it's also not as bad as people were making it out to be, as you should be able to see on screen here. Right now, at the time I'm recording this, it's at a 58.4%, which puts it at about 23,000 likes to 16,000 dislikes. And sure, not what I love to see, obviously, but as you can see from this next screen, views-wise, it did very well because everybody was talking about it and watching it, which is how I actually make my money, which is why that video wound up paying me about 3,000. And I even gained plenty of subscribers while I was at it. Now, this was kind of funny to me because one of the things people were saying about that review was actually that I must have been paid by BioWare for it, which is, of course, nonsense, ignoring entirely how I would absolutely never take anybody's money for a review. But the thing that was funny there to me really was that the people saying that and continually boosting the video via just watching it and commenting on it is actually what made me this money. Because if you don't know, 3K for about 650,000 views, that's much higher than normal. To give a better ballpark, like 1 million views is like 2 to 3 grand generally. But with that sort of metrics talk out of the way, let's actually talk about the rest of it. So, why did I enjoy Veilguard so much? Well, the funny thing is, if you actually look at all of the reviews about it, especially the ones that are, much more negative, obviously, I actually had many of the same criticisms of the game as everybody else had. I actually mentioned almost identically the exact problems those people voiced. I would say the main difference is those things simply didn't bother me as much, and that is largely because if you watch some of my videos about the Dragon Age series prior to Veilguard actually releasing, one of the big things I always said was that it was a series with an identity crisis, basically. Every one of those games was so different from the others that there really was no consensus about what a Dragon Age game even was, and what Dragon Age was to one person is entirely different to what it was from the next. And to that end, I went into Veilguard ready to play it for what it was and not what I wished it would be. And what it was is, of course, a more action-oriented title, focusing more on gameplay and combat than the admittedly deeper worlds and stories of some of the previous titles. And as somebody who plays plenty of more action-focused titles, that really just didn't rub me the wrong way, especially since that, regardless of whether or not you like the game otherwise, there was a ton of really great lore drops in Veilguard that are important to the broader world of Dragon Age, and for me, that was enough, but clearly for many others, it simply wasn't enough, and that is, of course, then why we already know that the Dragon Age series is now probably officially dead for at least the foreseeable next few decades, I imagine, because we've already seen EA basically say that the problem must have been that there wasn't enough live service elements in there. And while, I'm sure many of us disagree about Veilguard in one way or another, I think most of us can agree that, the lack of live service really wasn't the problem. So there you go, there's some information about Dragon Age the Veilguard. But we still have 4 other titles to get to, which is obviously what we're gonna do now. So moving right along, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum really, we then have Alpha Protocol. So Alpha Protocol is Obsidian Entertainment's spy RPG from way back in the day that is finally more available actually. When I initially reviewed Alpha Protocol a couple years back, it was not really available to buy anywhere. You either had to have just owned a physical copy of it from back when, or you of course could pirate it. Now since that video, several storefronts, I think Steam and GOG, have actually managed to sort out some licensing issues and get it back available for people, while actually also fixing some of the worst of the bugs that would cause it to crash frequently. So to that end, you can absolutely check out Alpha Protocol for yourself and see what I mean when I say that Alpha Protocol is probably the most fun you'll have with a game that you know is bad. Because while I think most of the games on this list, I would happily tell you I wouldn't really consider them bad personally for me. However, I will say Alpha Protocol is just kind of bad, but it's also just really fun at the same time. It's kind of like watching a sort of B-movie that in your head isn't great, but you're still really having a good time. And that's kind of, I think, the best way to sum up Alpha Protocol, because it has so many just super ambitious systems, so many winding pathways to its stories that cause all these little variations to like little cutscenes and stuff, and you can really see what they were trying to do, even if none of it really lands properly. And that's before you even start talking about the wonky AI systems, the absolutely busted and broken combat. But in spite of all of that stuff, I think Alpha Protocol manages to nail what probably matters the most, in that it is just a fun video game to play, even if its, actual systems are less than impressive at many intervals. But whether it's the over-the-top characters, the absolute cringe-inducing dialogue, or simply the fight with a coked-up mob boss, Alpha Protocol is simply a game that is so bad it's good. And if you got a little bit of cash to burn, I definitely think you should check it out. Now, with a title that is a little bit more in the sort of middle of the road for the middle of the video, we then have Slitterhead. So Slitterhead is a relatively recent release as well, releasing last year in 2024. It's a game that puts you in the role of I believe it's pronounced Hioki, which is effectively like a spirit whose job is to chase down these beings known as Slitterheads, as they are effectively eating humans' brains and infiltrating society, whereas you get to possess humans and then use their blood and powers to fight these things. And together it makes for some really novel systems, which unfortunately is really all the game has going for it. The actual gameplay of possessing various human beings and entities around to then fight these creatures and get a feel for combat and how each of the individual characters works and plays on top of what you can do with just possessing random individuals, and even some of the movement and whatnot that comes around with actually being able to do all of that makes for a really interesting time. But, everything else about the game is often pretty lackluster, I will fully admit. And I also think that its full price of $50 is way too expensive for what the game is. But if you're willing to put some of that stuff to the side and simply enjoy the actual possession gameplay and moving around, the cities and also just fighting these grotesque looking abominations, then I think there's a really good time to be had under the hood there. But more than anything, I would say I enjoyed Slitterhead because it was unique, and as somebody who has, as I've mentioned previously, reviewed hundreds of games, unique really tends to grab me more than anything else these days. Which brings me to my fourth entry, which just so happens to be the Technomancer, a title from Spiders, by which of course I mean the developer, not actual spiders. The Technomancer is a janky, weird little RPG from back in 2016 that I really love. It's got some pacing issues, some oddities in terms of combat and balance to be sure, but the setting and just the concepts at play really spoke to me. You see, in the Technomancer, we live on Mars, we play as a Technomancer, if you'd believe it, and that's basically a human who is mutated but still looks like a human, and this allows them to effectively conduct electricity, which gives you these powers that are really useful to the planet, where life and water are really a commodity. Now the catch here is mutants, which the Technomancers technically are, but nobody can actually tell, are really hated. They are looked down upon, ostracized, the whole nine. And so the Technomancer's big goal is to basically guard their own secret. And there's almost sort of a political drama at play between you and various factions, and you're going to make a bunch of choices while leading a group against the various foes you'll encounter along the way. And the Technomancer is just a game that really focuses on the stuff that's most important. Now, unfortunately, there are definitely some downsides to it. As I mentioned, the combat is less than great, especially on the higher difficulties, where a lot of what they did was just increase enemy health to sort of nonsense amounts, which can make things like dealing with the last boss in particular just an extreme grind, not so much because it's difficult, because it just has so much health, just to give a quick example. But nonetheless, in spite of all that stuff, I really enjoyed Technomancer, and I personally think it's the best thing that Spiders has put out. But that does bring me to my last entry, and this is actually something a little bit different with Phantom Fury. So Phantom Fury is a game that released in the first half of 2024, back in April, I believe, but it's basically just a boomer shooter, while also acting as a sequel to another game I believe was called Ion Fury. Now, probably important to mention that I did in fact do a sponsored video for Phantom Fury, but I kept playing it afterwards because I was having a pretty good time, even though I never wound up reviewing this one. But plenty of people obviously didn't enjoy it. Now, a lot of the initial complaints with the game's launch was the usual stuff, which is totally fair, like performance issues, things like that, and obviously that's pretty justified. Plenty of its other negative reviews were stuff like people upset with specific sound design choices. That is to say, things like the exact sound their footsteps made on any given surface was the type of stuff people were complaining about, which seemed especially nitpicky to me personally, but that's mostly because I was having so much fun playing it. You see, Phantom Fury really tries to recreate the feeling of a sort of over-the-top 80s action movie. You're going to be fighting all sorts of giant robots, interacting with all sorts of tech to do things like drop missiles and set up turrets, even participate in a few various vehicular sections. And while I do think certain levels in particular have problems with like pacing and generally directing the player around the given level so that way you can kind of get to the more interesting parts a little quicker, as having to plot around and look where to go in a game that is, trying to recreate action isn't exactly the best bet. But those actual action-packed moments, the individual levels, and even the various boss fights are things I just really enjoyed, and to me, expecting that sort of recreation of American action films going into the title, it managed to deliver on exactly that, which is why I had so much fun playing it, even if I didn't wind up reviewing it. And to that end, if you ever happen to be looking for a little breather from some heavier RPGs, I think Phantom Fury might just be able to do that for you, as it's a pretty short and sweet little title that's mostly just concerned about you turning enemies into a fine red mist. But I think that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. There has been 5 bad games that I enjoyed, but I'd love to hear about any titles that you might think are bad that you've enjoyed, or games that you went against the grain on, or even popular games that you didn't enjoy, things like that, which is a video I made just a few weeks back if you're interested, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.